Well, good evening and welcome to Queen Mary and to the Mile End Institute. It's wonderful to see a full lecture theatre, especially on such a wretchedly miserable night. So thank you for braving the rain for what is, I think, the fourth in our series of In Conversations this year. And it's a particular pleasure this evening to welcome as our conversationalist, Sir David Lidington. David is an exception to the rule that political careers are getting shorter. He brings to this evening's discussion, I think, 5 decades of political experience. In the 1970s, he was chairman of the Cambridge University Conservative Association. In the 1980s, he was a special advisor to Douglas Hurd, first at the Home Office and then at the Foreign Office. He was elected to Parliament for the first time in 1992, an election when an embattled Prime Minister, after 13 years of Conservative government, defied the polls to win a sensational victory, which may be something we come back to. He entered the shadow cabinet in the 2000s, and then in 2010 moved into government with David Cameron. And he spent 6 years as Europe Minister, a time when Europe was perhaps the defining issue of British politics. And I'm sure we'll be talking about the referendum lock, the renegotiations, and of course the Brexit vote of 2016. After 2016, he served in a number of roles as Leader of the House of Commons, Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Cabinet Office Minister, and was often described in the press as Theresa May's de facto deputy. But it wasn't all play along the way. He did a PhD in history, which is always a good sign. He won University Challenge, and at various points in his career, he worked closely with William Hague, Michael Howard, and Anne Widdecombe. So, a great deal for us to talk about. We're going to chat for a little while, and then I'll open it up to questions from the floor. So we're looking forward very much to hearing what you would like to ask. But can we begin by welcoming David Lidington to Queen Mary? So, as a historian, I always like to begin at the beginning. You were born, I think, in Lambeth, not very far from here. Could you tell us something about your early life and perhaps, where the politician came from? Was it a political household? Were your parents conservative?
I'm born in King's College Hospital, and sort of my parents had a sort of the top flat in a long demolished sort of 4-storey mansion block on the South Circular Road, their first married home. And when I was 2, and my next brother down was on the way, they moved out to the northwest edge of London, Northwood. And so as both, though born in South London, I was brought up very much North London, Northwood, and then I moved to Enfield later on in my life. Dad was a local government officer for Middlesex County Council, then the Greater London Council. My mother was very much the way in those days. Gave up work. I think she'd be working as a secretary in the early 50s to bring up children. And then she later, when my youngest brother was regularly just off at school all day and able to be fairly independent, she retrained as a social worker and specialising in sort of occupational therapy for elderly and disabled people. And not particularly political. They always voted, and if you ask, they'd say who they voted for. My mum, I think, always voted Conservative, although her father, my granddad, was an absolute red-hot socialist. And my father usually voted Conservative, but I know he did vote Labour at least once, and I think voted SDP or Alliance in one of the later elections. But not one where you talked about politics the whole time. But you were aware of that. And also it was a bit, you got to, it's when visiting, both sets of grandparents similarly would always vote. My mum's parents, I think, were just regular Labour. My certainly, and they had grown up in a really slum area of North Kensington, and my mum was brought up in a flat, again, long since demolished, in a tenement block with just off sort of the Golden Road with 2 rooms and a kitchen and a earth closet down in the yard downstairs. But my father came from a more comfortable background, and his parents, I think, were sort of conservatives always. And so I was aware about politics. They took a newspaper, my mum took a newspaper, they watched the news. I think I sort of found it interesting. It was, it's the same thing that attracted me to history as a discipline. That it's about, politics is ultimately about people, how they relate to each other, how decisions are taken, how power is exercised. And then when I was in my teens, there were 2 things happening. First of all, we were living in Hillingdon Borough, and we had what I would think of as the prototype radical Labour council, run by a man called John Bartlett, who was nicknamed the Red Alderman by the local press, who was pursuing a policy of sort of, for example, of trying to buy up private occupied houses, demolish them, build local authority housing there, and various other things that were very controversial. And then also, when I got in my teens, you were in the time of the 1970s of trade union power, of that becoming a defining issue of our time. When I was doing my sixth O-levels and sixth form and A-levels, every winter the lights went off at some point because one or other union was on strike. Those are the days when Mike Yarwood, who of course was the Culshaw of his day, had prime TV time slot on Saturday evenings, and he could impersonate, and did, 6 trade union leaders, and everybody knew instantly who they were. And that, I think, that always sticks in my mind as a mark of just how things have changed. Well, you can, opinions may differ in the room about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a sign of just how politics is different now from how it looked then. And it's those things that sort of drew me to the right of politics. And I was at a school where debate and argument were encouraged, and so I got involved in the debating society. I was quite shy as a little boy, so I sort of disciplined myself to ask a question every time I got an outside speaker at a general studies lesson, something like that. And had some really fierce arguments, and I shudder probably at how sort of naive and crude some of my arguments were then. But that, when you're in your teens, that's how you try things out and test arguments. So that that was where it all started.
So it's clearly a very politically exciting period. In the 1970s.
Absolutely.
But it's also quite a dislocating period for the Conservative Party, isn't it? You've had the Who Governs Britain election, the collapse of the Heath government, the felling of Heath by Margaret Thatcher. You've then got Enoch Powell defecting to the Ulster Unionists, concern about the National Front. And I wonder, where would you have seen yourself in Conservative politics?
I was an ardent Thatcherite.
Right.
And because I felt when she emerged in early 75 to challenge Ted Heath, and I joined the Conservative Party, in early 1975, within a fortnight of her being elected leader of the party. And because I felt there was somebody who was at last, it seemed to have the will to do something about the state that the country was in, where every night there were films, the TV bulletins of picketing outside this or that place of employment, a strike being called by a show of hands in the factory car park, the debates that were starting then about secret ballots rather than a show of hands, about whether there should be legal limits placed on picketing, and I was very much on you'd have classed me then on the dry side of Conservative politics in the arguments in the early 1980s, and it was incredibly exciting intellectually. So I read Hayek, I read Popper, I was reading stuff from the Centre for Policy Studies as that was published. I remember Keith Joseph coming to give a lecture at the Cambridge Union, and the place being absolutely packed to the rafters, people standing. And it if you were on the centre right, it was intellectually really stimulating and exciting to do that. Whereas I think for my friends who were on the left at the time at Cambridge, there was a sense that they were on the defensive there.
So you're a politically mobilised student at Cambridge. But you're also reading history.
Yeah.
You wrote a PhD, I think, on the Elizabethan Court of Exchequer.
Yep, it's really about the enforcement of social and economic legislation, and or non-enforcement of it in many cases. That was done largely at the Exchequer Court.
Right. Is there a parallel universe in which I'm sitting here this evening talking to Dr. Lidington about his long academic career? Were you ever drawn in that direction?
Yeah, I suppose I was drawn in that direction, and it's the reason I didn't go down. I don't think I was intellectually bright enough to hold my own. I'd studied under Geoffrey Elton, who's one of the great sort of figures in sort of 16th century history. Amazing man, refugee family from what is now Czech Republic, where his father had been professor of classics at the University of Prague. They changed their name from Ehrenberg to Elton during the war, and Geoffrey became Regius Professor of English History at Cambridge. His brother Lewis became Professor of Physics at Sussex, and Lewis's son is Ben Elton, who used to refer to my supervisor as his fascist uncle, I think, with a tongue in cheek. And I know it's nowhere near to that class of scholar, but also, even if there had been the academic jobs available, I was starting to think by that stage I've been in academic institutions for a long time. I ought at least try something different. And when I was doing my doctoral research, I deliberately gave myself a break from politics, and it was deliberate as a way of testing whether I really missed it or not. And I found, I had been bitten by the bug. And so I suppose I was in my early 20s. I said, look, I will need to earn a living, but then, let's give this a go and see if this gets anywhere. I think I was always aware from the start that there's no certainties in politics. There's a lot of luck, whether the dice fall your way. But I thought, let's give it a go.
But I think you have an ongoing interest in history, and I'm always interested in how people's understanding of history shapes their politics. Do you think that it's had any impact on you as a politician?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. I think simply that you look back and a number of things. First of all, there's a sense of the transience of almost any political decision. I mean, how many even prime ministers are really remembered now? You stop people in the street and ask them which prime ministers of the past can you list? It's going to be a small number. And even you now hear the chatter about, we live in a fallen age of politics now. There used to be giants in the past. I say, there were great people, but let's go back to the Thatcher government or to the Attlee government, right? How many secretaries of state for transport can you remember? There at the time, if you're as old as me, you might think Ernest Marples and Barbara Castle, but that's probably it. And there's an awful lot of people, even at cabinet level, who are not forgotten. I think if you look at opinion polls, there's normally about 4 or 5 members of the cabinet that people remember and recognise at any one time. So transience. Also, I think it does, as an academic subject, it does teach you about international relations. You learn that different countries have different traditions, different ways of doing things, different interests which evolve over history, and that it is wrong just to assume that everybody in the world fits neatly into the same set of moral assumptions, political assumptions that you might make. But also, as a subject, I think that, as I was concerned, what history helps with is an appreciation of the other. And I've never thought about it consciously as cause and effect, but I do think even in my sort of zealous youth, I might have always managed to get on with people with whom I disagreed about politics. I've never seen why political disagreement, even fundamental political disagreement, makes friendship impossible, let alone civility towards some other people. And I think what history as a topic does is just to remind you constantly that in different times and in different places, people thought in utterly different ways from how they do now. And why actually, don't get me on probably to the so-called woke debate, but I get irritated when there's an attempt to judge people in the past by current standards, and current standards are often different from standards and assumptions that were held even 10 years ago, let alone 200 years ago.
So you take these various historical sensitivities, and I think first of all you worked for BP, Rio Tinto, and then you went to work as a special advisor for Douglas Hurd and at the Home Office, and that was quite an exciting period at the Home Office.
Yeah, absolutely, it was. I mean, it came. What came in between was that while I was working for Rio Tinto, I fought my first parliamentary election in 1987 as the Conservative candidate for Vauxhall. Which was great fun because there's no expectation I would come anywhere near winning. And so there's no pressure whatsoever. And actually it taught me a lot because I'd been brought up in a really reasonably comfortable sort of middle class environment. And actually go down and talking to see some people really going through grim times, the sort of the like bad housing and low incomes and crime and drugs and everything else. And actually, but also people who can't see how they can make democratic politics work for them. And one chap I remembered, it had a damp in his house. I said, how long's that puddle been there? He said, oh, it's been damp here for about 9 years. I said, well, haven't you complained to the council about this? Oh, I did go to the local housing office about 7 or 8 years ago. They said they'd send someone around, but nobody ever came. And there was an assumption that decisions were taken and done to you, but that you didn't have agency yourself, and you didn't know how to try to make the system work for you. But that was huge. That was hugely enjoyable doing that. And, I always say if you worn a blue rosette round the Stockwell Park estate a year after the Brixton riots, you cope with most things in politics. And most people don't care enough about politics to have a row with you on your doorstep. Actually, when I went round Brixton and Stockwell estates, I mean, the reaction was more like to be shock than anger. And so I learned a lot from that. And then the Hurd's office rang me up and said, look, we're about to appoint a new special advisor. Are you interested? Cut a long story short, they appointed me. Home Office, you were going the time, Home Office then was responsible for broadcasting. So we were having some of the debates about the future of the BBC, about Channel 4, about the start of cable and satellite broadcasting, that are topical even today. So the licence fee was a subject even then, and Douglas used to get quite wearied at times because Monday mornings, number 10 might be on the line, and Margaret and Dennis had been sitting at Chequers at the weekend, sort of using the remote control and sort of finding something to be irritated about, and so the message to come across on the Monday. But also, Hurd was trying to introduce penal reforms to get prison population down, the Crown Prosecution Service was being created about that time as well. Attempt to reform the terms and conditions of employment for prison officers. While the numbers then were very small compared with those today, that immigration and asylum were still high-profile issues at that time, and the Home Office was by always dealing with really, really difficult and issues and uncooperative people. And you still had, I wrote his, drafted his conference speeches, he'd always sort of polished them himself. And those were the days when capital punishment was still a live issue. And Margaret Thatcher, who was a supporter of restoring hanging, used to appear on the platform when the Home Secretary was speaking and applaud vigorously every time somebody in the hall got up to the rostrum and called for the rope to come back. So Douglas, as an abolitionist, was actually doing what I think politicians need to do, and he took it head on. And just said, in number one speech, said, right, he'd had all the stuff, bring back the rope, said, right, let's start with a few words about capital punishment, said why he was not in favour of it, and why it was not going to be coming back. Then he got on to the prepared text and messages, and actually be willing to confront people and explain the disagreement with them is something I think politicians have been in danger of losing in more recent times.
And I think you would also have been at the Home Office when the Hillsborough tragedy took place.
Oh, God, I remember that. That was because it came completely out of the blue, of course. And Hurd was called away. It was the following, must have been the Monday, and Margaret Thatcher was going up to visit victims and families. And Douglas Hurd and Colin Moynihan, who was the sports minister, was sort of put in a helicopter as well. And he came back, I remember, saying just, he was in awe of Margaret Thatcher. This is somebody who's not automatically been Heath's political secretary. He's not automatically a Thatcherite. But he said just the sheer energy that she showed in going down the wards, talking to everybody, completely unaffected fashion, waving away the lunch that the hospital management had laid on, and in particular going in to see the mother of one young man who was in a coma on life support, probably going to die. And basically, Thatcher said he just put her arms around this mother, tried to comfort her. And that very human side of her, which wasn't often on public show, which he told me about there. And then the arguments that followed, the ban on standing, at football grounds, but also there were proposals for licensing football grounds that were, and sports stadiums would eventually were dropped. There was some really draconian things. You would have to have, be a member of an association to be able to get access to any ground. And these poor civil servants who were responsible for this area of policy never normally had any dealings with ministers or Parliament, brought up blinking. I remember them sort of say, well, you could, some idea, a very bad idea to do this, Secretary of State, you can't do this, can't do that. I remember Hurd, who's normally very equable, say, look, you've told me at great length about things that I can't do. Can you please, for a moment, explain the powers that I do have to take some action here? But he was normally, I learned, what I learned hugely from Douglas was the way in which, as a senior minister, he handled his officials. He always respected them.
Would you mind speaking up?
Sorry, he always respected them. He always listened to their advice, but he'd weigh that advice, and he wasn't afraid to override it, and no official objected to that. But he took them seriously and respected them, and was always courteous. And then he'd take a decision and get on. And I remember one meeting where he knew how to handle the press. One meeting where he said, look, no, we don't need to think about how the press are going to react first. If we take the decision that we think is the right one to take, then we think about how we sell that as best we can to the country. And again, that's something I think that too often has been reversed by particular ministers of both big parties in more recent years. And that the Hurd approach is the one that I think we need to get back to.
So then in 1992, you came into Parliament for Aylesbury, and that was a very safe Conservative seat, I think. So you presumably weren't surprised that you were elected, but were you surprised that the party won a majority?
I felt it turn in the last few days. I'd gone into the election thinking, oh, we're likely to be in opposition. As it then went on, I thought, there's a chance here. And it was after, these psephologists and the analysts may say there's something different, but I felt the mood change after Neil Kinnock's Sheffield rally and the speech there. And I remember going back the 2 or 3 days afterwards that followed that. That was on the last Sunday, I think. And going back, particularly on people we had previously canvassed who said they were undecided. They were coming off the perch at least 2, if not 3 to 1 Conservative, rather than Liberal Democrat in the seat I was fighting. And I thought there's something up here. And then on the election day in 92, what I remember is the very high turnout everywhere, all parts of the constituency. And no one was quite sure what that meant. And they did come out and voted for Major. So yeah, I think everybody was pretty surprised at the result. But one did sense a bit of a change in the final days.
There's been a lot of talk, of course, lately about whether Rishi Sunak can pull off the same trick in 2024. And it sounds like one lesson for Keir Starmer is not to hold a victory rally. But do you think there are any lessons that Rishi Sunak can learn from that election, or are the circumstances just different?
I think the lesson for the Prime Minister is don't ever give up, because politics is inherently unpredictable. Just as Theresa May started the 2017 election with a lead of 20-25% in the polls, and it all drained away during the course of the campaign. So I would say don't give up hope, and I'd say Keir, that he's a decent, honourable man, is not a Blair. He's not a Corbyn, and that helps him with the broader electorate. He doesn't frighten people the way Jeremy did, but he doesn't inspire and excite people in the way I remember Tony Blair doing in 97. But I think the other message is to Conservative MPs and the party more widely, which is that in 1992, the entire party, left and right, despite the bitterness of the politics over the overthrow of Margaret Thatcher, basically set that aside, thought we've got to try and win this election, and did rally together. And I think the problem with my party at the moment, and I do blame parliamentarians primarily for this, is that they seem to me to be often uninterested in actually winning an election and trying to form a government, and more interested in pursuing whatever pet cause or pet hatreds and resentments that they have accumulated.
Well, that mood of unity in 1992 dissipated quite quickly, didn't it? It's I mean, your first term in Parliament was the term of John Major's bastards, of the great Maastricht battles, of John Major calling a leadership election against himself. Now, we often think of the Conservative Party before the 90s as particularly loyal, particularly well-disciplined, and it feels like something changes in the 90s.
Something did change. I think that a couple of things changed. First of all, there was the erosion of deference that we see in all walks of life, all institutions in this country, and that applied to the Conservative Party as much as anything else. Secondly, and allied with that, the 92 elections saw the retirement from Parliament of almost all those who left who had served in the Second World War, and therefore carried with them certain assumptions about discipline and following the leader and keeping your trap shut in public, that were of that generation. And those of us who were coming in were just for different ways of thinking. And that's just a generational change. I do think, though, also that the politics of 1990, the overthrow of Margaret Thatcher, did still carry deep resentments forward. And while people suppressed those for the election campaign, once the election was over, they came out and lasted a long, long time. And I remember even after the defeat in 1997, one senior Conservative MP saying to me, apropos the then leadership contest, that if Ken Clarke won, he was going to resign the Conservative whip, despite the fact we just gone through a record defeat, because he could never forgive Ken Clarke for his role, as he saw it, in the overthrow of Margaret Thatcher.
And that bitterness seems to have become very concentrated on the question of Europe. And I wonder why you think that question was so neuralgic for the Conservative Party and has remained so ever since.
I think that it's in part because of there is a real issue about the idea of nationhood, and I do think that in the UK we have developed a different sort of national mythology derived from a very different experience for most European countries of the middle of the 20th century, when for most European countries, the middle of the 20th century saw democratic institutions and systems fail in the face of domestic extremism from left and right, and then their overthrow by absolutely vicious, sadistic tyranny. Whereas for us, the story of the same period was about how national solidarity, national institutions enabled us to survive and stand alone for a time against Nazism. And I do think that that has led to a profound divergence in how people think about their countries. And I used to chat, having a lunch with an Estonian foreign minister in Tallinn, and I played this thesis out and said, well, this is, I think, why people in Britain do think differently about Europe, do worry about the idea of sovereignty and independence. He said, look, for us, it is different. He said, we're a small nation, 1.25 million. We lost a quarter of our population between the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and the Soviets crushing the resistance in 1946. We were fought over by the Red Army and the Nazis. We then lived under Soviet occupation for 50 years. He said, when you have that happen to you, you want to grab every little scrap of European integration that's going to try to stop it happening to you again. And that you found again and again in so many European countries. So I think there was that element. And I think it became also because Margaret Thatcher aligned herself at the latter stages of her premiership and after she left office with an increasingly hard sceptical line on Europe. The people who felt she should have been supported in 1990 would rally to her. They were defending her values by taking a hard line on Europe. And I think just the way in which things went. I look back, although the Maastricht and the subsequent treaties, there were good arguments at the time for not submitting them to a referendum. I do wonder whether, had there been some referendum in the way the Irish had on Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon, that actually would have dealt with the problem there, because people would have felt that they had their say and probably would have voted in favour. That might have avoided the rupture that came in after 2016.
So instead, you get that pressure building through 13 years in opposition, which I think must be the longest time the Conservative Party has spent out of power since the 18th century. And then when you came back in 2010, you're given that chalice as Minister of Europe.
I'd spent, it tells you how tells you the uncertainties of politics. I'd spent the previous 2.5 years shadowing the Middle East, and before that, shadowing Northern Ireland, and so everybody, including the Foreign Office officials, expected that I was going to go in as Minister of State for Middle East and North Africa. Instead of which, when the coalition was formed, Cameron rang me up and, David, I'd like you to do Europe. And I took a deep breath. So, well, Prime Minister, of course, honoured, delighted to do it, happy to do so. But you do realise the last two responsibilities you've given me have been Northern Ireland and the Middle East. I get all the easy stuff, don't I? and I think it was partly to do with coalition and the allocation of ministerial posts at the different ranks between the two parties and the different departments. And Nick Clegg wanted one of the Minister of State posts at FCO. And I think it was also partly because Europe had been shadowed by Marc Francois. And I think that probably that was a bit more than certainly than Nick Clegg was prepared to swallow. I don't know whether Cameron would have done left to himself. But that's the way it panned out. And it was fascinating. I mean, I got to every European country bar Belarus, and I never felt I could justify the taxpayer sending me to Andorra, Monaco, San Marino or Liechtenstein. But all the others I went to, most of them twice or in some cases a lot more than that. did it for longer than anybody's done the Europe portfolio, and again, just got an understanding of how those different countries think, what their priorities and interests are. I must have done 60 or 70 Council of Ministers meetings, NATO meetings, Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Council of Europe, and lots of bilateral stuff.
And did that experience change your view of the European question?
Yes, I mean, it made me. I always used to say that, on Europe, the start I've said, look, I'm a skeptic in the proper sense, that I'm skeptical of grand plans, sort of big designs and blueprints, but they need those things. They need to be tested. We need to be pragmatic. And the longer I was there, the more I don't think it was just going native, as some of my colleagues would have said, but you actually see how you can influence things and how you can use your membership of this powerful club to advance your national interests, whether that is in terms of trade agreements, where the EU has far more leverage because of the size of its market than the UK on its own, whether it's by developing single market legislation, you can get access for your country's firms to the markets of countries which, absent the EU single market, would be much more protectionist and inclined to do special favours for their own firms. And so you just start to see, and you also see, going around other countries, how this is holding things together. I mean, that despite what's happening in Hungary, and despite the problems in a number of Central European countries, the pattern in Central Europe in the years since 1989-90 has been much more successful than the pattern of development after 1919-1920. And I do think that is in large measure due to the impact of the accession process and EU membership in starting to entrench not just a market economy, but rule of law, respect for human rights, democratic institutions in those countries. I mean, some have got a way to go, but I think it's better than it was in the early 20th century. So for those reasons, I became more firmly convinced with each year that passed that our national interests were best served by continuing to be members.
You talked earlier about Douglas Hurd challenging his party on capital punishment. Do you think that your party, and perhaps you, should have been more willing to challenge the Eurosceptics in your own party?
Oh, I think if you look back at what I said in Hansard and in speeches, I did my share of that, and more sometimes. And I do think that, and I would honestly say, I think, Robert, I did make the argument that as to why it was in our interests that we remain members. That some things that are very frustrating and we don't win every battle, but actually, overall, the balance is in our favour. I do think that David Cameron could and should have made that argument on the basis of national interest earlier. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that we lost the referendum was that the argument started to be made far too late by the time that the contrary argument for leaving and seeking national liberation was already pretty well entrenched, particularly, but not just on the right.
I don't know whether you were consulted on the decision to hold a referendum.
No, I was told about it.
Right. Did you agree?
No. I mean, the Prime Minister decided that it was a decision taken basically by, there were three people in the room plus a couple of aides. So it was Prime Minister, William Hague as Foreign Secretary, and George Osborne as Chancellor, and it was taken by those people, and I think I've been the debate about whether to have such a referendum was live, certainly within my party, but I think the previous week, certainly the previous month, I had been at the dispatch box making the arguments against it. So I was pretty disappointed where that decision was made. But you accept it. I think there was hope at the time that it actually might allow the different wings of the argument within the Conservative Party in Europe to come together. And I certainly, on those of us who supported the Remain side, there was a huge confidence at the beginning that this was going to go well, that we get the sort of result that we'd seen in 1975.
Was that confidence a problem, or is there something about the way is there a different story in which the referendum goes the other way?
Yeah, but it was close enough for it to have gone a different way. I think the argument about from national interest should have been made earlier. I think that when it came to the actual formal campaign, the argument was unbalanced. It was too much about all the negatives. So those were real, and I think those arguments have been vindicated by what's happened. But the appeal to idealism and to values was not made, and I think it should have been. The Labour Party did not play the role on the Remain campaign that it was expected to do. And I remember being pulled off all media one day. I was booked to do the Today programme, and I was suddenly pulled off everything. And so Jeremy Corbyn's about to make a big intervention, in favour of Remain. It never happened, the entire day. So I think there's a problem there. And I think that so some of it is the campaign, but it's events. You saw the polls really start to narrow when immigration became a high-profile issue, which was, first of all, with the strike in Calais in August 2015, and then once that dropped out of the headlines in September, you had the refugee crisis from Syria, the Aegean, Balkans, Austria, Germany, and you saw that. And what Farage did brilliantly was to link the EU, which people didn't really rank highly in their list of priorities, with the issue of immigration, which at that moment really people did regard as important. And the line about, take back control was something you got played back to you on doorsteps.
And then after the result came in, did you have any inkling of how difficult this was going to prove and how destructive it would be for the Conservative Party?
Yes, but I didn't appreciate how bad it was going to be. I felt it was a grim time. The day after the referendum was not my favourite one, because while my Prime Minister was resigning on the steps of Number 10, I was getting a plane to Luxembourg to explain to the Foreign Affairs Council what had happened. And it was never the case that the 27 were plotting to stop Brexit. 27 took the view that it was very sad, very regrettable, but how we dealt with it was up to us. And I was Frank-Walter Steinmeier, now the German president, saying to me, "Look, I've seen the result. It's tragic," he said, "but it was close, but it is decisive." He looked at the figures. He said, "You can't argue with that." And yes, it was. I don't think we realised how bitter it was going to be. I knew it was going to be very difficult because I thought hard about what the alternatives to membership would be, and none of them, in my view, matched membership in terms of the advantage that we would get overall. I think I had assumed that everybody would accept the referendum result and do their best to come up with a negotiated outcome that did the best we could for the country in those circumstances. But instead of which you just had the division getting deeper.
And there was a point in the autumn of 2019 when it really seemed like British politics was in danger of breaking down. And there was a lot of talk of a government of national unity. And the name that tended to come up when people suggested that was yours. Were you ever approached about leading such a government?
I had a number of colleagues who came to see me and said, look, we think the scenario they painted was that Theresa May would voluntarily decide to step down as Prime Minister after pressure from both the pro and the anti-Europeans in the cabinet. And if that happened, would I be prepared to come forward and if necessary, we tried to push a deal, an exit deal through with opposition support. I maintained civil relations with the opposition, although I think with the Corbyn leadership, it was probably the most difficult leadership for any Conservative leader to have dealt with. And so, the idea was put to me, and I had those events happen, I would have been willing to serve, but I never thought it was remotely likely. I mean, first to start with, the idea that Theresa May would voluntarily decide to step down seemed to be completely at odds with everything I got to know about her. That's just not how she operates, and she regarded it as her duty to carry on working and fighting to try to get a deal that she thought was workable through the House of Commons. Secondly, I didn't see how, even if she stepped aside, that there would be agreement within the Conservative Party on a coronation. I mean, I just thought, there's bound to be a very divisive election campaign, and that the outcome, if the outcome would be you, and this was a real risk that if you did a deal with the opposition, that you would irrevocably split the Conservative Party, and that was something that was clearly a possibility we had to live with by that stage. So it was there as an idea, but frankly, I think the chances of it happening were always slimmest of the slim. I never really took it as a serious prospect.
So you then announced that you would stand down from Parliament in 2019, and I think there was always a sense that you perhaps weren't a natural fit with a Boris Johnson leadership. You may or may not want to comment on that, but
I do. Yeah, I have to comment. I wrote to him when he became leader, saying congratulations, wished him well, but I didn't want to be considered as part of his cabinet, and I had at that stage decided I was definitely going to stand down from Parliament. But I thought that I doubt he'd offered me anything anyway. But he'd won that leadership election on a clear platform, and I thought you can't have cabinet ministers who are fundamentally in disagreement with you, and either it's an impossible thing for me to live with, or it makes for division within cabinet, which we'd seen enough of, more than enough. And I'd been on the front bench for 20 years continuously by that stage. So I thought, all right, it's time to step back. So that's what I decided to do. And the decision to leave Parliament really came when the election was called. I'd always thought 30 years was the most I wanted to do, and left just before 28.
Well, that leads into a final question before I throw it open to the room, which is, when you look at the Conservative Party today, do you see the same party that you joined? Do you think a young David Lidington would be drawn to it in the same way that you were in the 70s?
I think the figures that the polls report for voting intentions of young people, school and university leavers, speak for themselves. So I think it would be more difficult. I think the Conservative Party has to ask itself some hard questions as to why it not only is getting such a frankly risible proportion of support amongst the youngest voters, but why it is lagging so far behind at the moment amongst people in their 30s and even 40s who have careers, responsibilities at work and to families, and yet are not seeing the Conservative Party as a natural home for them in the way that they once did. So, after just short of 50 years as a party member, there's a whole sort of history of networks and friendships and loyalties that you build up you don't rupture easily. But I think if you were just coming to this fresh, the party is less attractive than it used to be, and I think that there's far too much what David Willett terms bring-backery, and there is a rancorous nature to some of the language that is used. And it's not just on the right that this happens. I mean, you see this in parts of the left, and social media is responsible, in my view, for aggravating this. But actually, growing up elected politicians ought to see beyond this and actually try to speak with respect and civility to one another, however strongly they disagree.
It's been a wonderful discussion. Before we thank David, can I just flag up our next event at the Mile End Institute, which is a webinar, so you don't have to come out in the rain. And it's a history of British elections. Ian Dale has a volume coming with an essay on every election since 1830. So you can decide, will 2024 be more like 1852 or 1857? It should be a really interesting event, so please do sign up for that and log on. But it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your time, and please can we thank David Lidington for this evening.